What is ironstone, and how do you know if yours is the real deal? Ironstone has become really popular in the last few years, and I have seen so many fakes and reproductions, not only on Etsy, but in antique malls and other antique stores as well. So I thought it would be the perfect time to share with you how to tell if your ironstone is real or fake. Hi everyone, I'm Melissa from the blog hymnsandhome.com, and I love to collect vintage and antique pieces, and especially vintage dishes. I have always had a soft spot in my heart, as long as I can remember, for pretty plates and cups and saucers and bowls, all sorts of stuff, especially ironstone. Now, when I started collecting ironstone back in, I think, my freshman year of college even, I didn't know that it was ironstone. I just saw these pretty white plates and blue and white plates, and I started collecting them. It's only in the last few years that I've really started to research ironstone and other vintage dishes because I started my own vintage Etsy shop. I wanted to learn as much as I could about the pieces before listing them to make sure that I was giving people authentic pieces and pricing them fairly. So today I'm going to give you a little bit about the history of ironstone and what it is, and also what it isn't. I'm going to give you some key tips for identifying ironstone when you're out shopping. I'm also going to identify some of the major fakes I've seen out there on the market and how people actually try to trick you into believing that something is old when it's not. It's really quite sad. I'll share a little bit about my own ironstone collection, and I'll point you to some of my favorite resources for identifying the manufacturing date of some of your ironstone pieces. Now, this is mostly meant to be a helpful overview. This is not going to be comprehensive, so I'm mainly going to touch on English ironstone, American ironstone, and fakes. I'm not really going to get too much into French or other European countries. I know that there are a lot out there. I'm going to mainly cover those two and how to determine what's real. So when it comes to ironstone, a lot of people automatically jump to white pitchers, white plates. You're probably thinking of Old English ironstone. So ironstone was first developed right at the beginning around the 1800s, and it was designed because they wanted to come up with elegant, beautiful dinnerware that was accessible for the common person. It needed to be beautiful to use, but also needed to wear like iron, hence the name ironstone. Pottery that's considered to be ironstone was actually called a lot of different things by the manufacturers, including semi-porcelain, stone china, opaque porcelain, vitrified china, and more. Does ironstone actually contain iron? The earliest ironstone was a mixture of Cornwall clay, iron slag, and other materials. So at least in the very beginning, it did actually contain iron in some form. Other manufacturers had their own recipes, and it continued to evolve over the years. Pottery tends to fall into one of three categories. You have earthenware, stoneware, and ironstone. Earthenware is the most basic, and even though it's been fired in the kiln, it's not fired at one of the highest temperatures, and it is not vitrified. It's opaque and porous, and it cannot hold up to having liquids in it because it will soak up the liquids. Stoneware, on the other hand, is fired at a higher temperature, so it is considered vitrified, and it can withstand holding liquids. And it's made of clay and other materials like that. Ironstone is fired at the highest temperature, also considered vitrified, and can withstand holding liquids. It's also arguably the most durable of the three. It was designed to withstand everyday use, but to look beautiful while doing so. Ironstone was first produced right around 1800 in England by William Turner, but it was first patented by Charles Mason around 1813. His patent only lasted around 14 years, and once his patent expired, everybody jumped on the ironstone bandwagon and started coming up with their own formulas. There are so many producers of English ironstone, other European countries' ironstone, American ironstone. The list is just, in fact, overwhelming. There are actually lots of different types of ironstone. Most often people think of white ironstone, just plain white. There's transfer wear, flow blue, mulberry, copper luster, like ones with decorative details. You've got the whole gamut out there. For the purposes of this video, we're mainly just going to cover English ironstone, American ironstone, how to tell the difference, and how to tell the difference between the real deal and the fakes. I also just want to say that there is absolutely nothing wrong with a reproduction. Reproductions can be beautiful and enjoyable, but I want to make sure that you are paying for what you get. So the last thing I would want to see is you pay an antique price for a reproduction. I've even bought reproductions myself just because I thought they were beautiful, but I bought them at a price that I considered fair for a reproduction. I know when I shared this on Instagram last year, I got some people saying, but it's still beautiful. And I totally agree, it's still beautiful. But like I said, you want to make sure you're getting the right price and getting what you expect it to be. All right, so you're out shopping at the thrift store or the antique mall. You see this beautiful piece of ironstone, or what you think is ironstone, but you want to make sure it is. So let's go over how to tell if it's actually ironstone. So one of the easiest ways to tell if something is ironstone or not is to turn it over and look for what's called a maker's mark or a backstamp. This is the mark that the manufacturer put on the bottom of the piece because they wanted everybody to know who made it because they were proud of it. This one right here says Royal Ironstone China, Alfred Meekin, England. Now let's go over a few things real quick. There will not always be a backstamp. Sometimes there will, sometimes there won't. If it doesn't have a backstamp, that doesn't mean it's not ironstone, but very often they would put a backstamp. So another important thing, just because it has a backstamp doesn't mean it's the real deal. This is where things can get kind of tricky. You want to look at what the backstamp says as well as the features in the backstamp. If you're out and about, I suggest doing a quick internet search. When I'm searching on the internet for a backstamp, I will typically put in something like Royal Ironstone China, Alfred Meekin Limited, England, so exactly what the backstamp says, as well as the word backstamp or maker's mark. And I will look up under the image search for this exact image to make sure that it actually existed in history and that it was actually produced. There are modern manufacturers out there that will design their logos to look antique. And I will show you that in just a second. I have one that looks very convincing that's unfortunately very fake. This is the real deal. So the backstamp is one way to tell. Let's say that it doesn't have a backstamp. How else can you tell? Well, one way is just by looking at it. This is Old English ironstone. Now, English ironstone, the old variety, tends to have more of a creamy bluish undertone, so kind of a cool undertone, whereas American ironstone, which was produced later, because in fact, most of the white ironstone that was produced by England that was not decorated, just the plain stuff, went over to America. It was actually mainly produced for the American market because the Americans liked the white plain stuff, whereas the British tend to like the more decorative and colorful stuff. So it was mainly produced for the American market, but later on in the 1800s, the Americans decided to take things into their own hands and start producing their own version of ironstone as well, which we'll get to in a minute with the likes of Homer Laughlin. We'll get into that in a second. So if you're trying to identify Old English ironstone, it's going to look white and creamy with this beautiful luster with kind of a cool bluish undertone. The American stuff tends to be more yellowish and warm in undertone, as well as some of the later English pieces. They tend to have a little more yellowish look too. So the best thing you could do is to study a piece of genuine ironstone and compare it to a modern piece. This is not ironstone. This is a picture that was made in Italy. I found it at Goodwill and I thought it was beautiful, so I bought it. It has a very different look from the ironstone, and it's probably hard to tell on camera But the best thing you can do is study two of them side by side. Once you've trained your eye to identify ironstone, you can pretty well pick it out across the thrift store on the shelf. Sometimes my heart kind of skips a beat. I'll have to show you this, one of the most beautiful finds I've ever had at the thrift store. I'll share that in a minute. My heart just about leapt out of my chest when I saw it, and it's the oldest piece I've ever found at the thrift store. So I'll share that in a minute. So that's luster and color. Another way to identify ironstone, and this might get you some weird looks in the thrift store or the antique store, it's how it sounds. So if I pick up this modern Italian pitcher and I tap on it with my knuckles, which I'm going to do, it sounds kind of like a thud. It doesn't have much ring to it. Hopefully you can hear that on the video. It just sounds kind of thud-like. Let's compare this to this old English ironstone pitcher. Sounds kind of like a bell, doesn't it? Old ironstone, when you very carefully hold on to it like this, or you know, if you hold it like this very carefully by the handle, it's going to have more of a bell-like ring to it than modern china would. Another key factor in identifying ironstone is its weight. It's going to be heavy for its size. This is actually quite heavy. When this is completely filled with water, as it would have been because it's a wash basin pitcher, this would have been enormously heavy. I don't know how people managed. I guess they just built up their arm strength more, or maybe I'm a wimp or something, I don't know. But this would have been extremely heavy filled with water. It is extremely heavy filled with water, I know, because I've put flowers in it before. But anyway, it's going to be very heavy for its size. However, it's not going to be outrageously heavy. So it's going to be heavy for its size, but it's not going to feel like it's been filled with concrete or something. This one is actually outrageously heavy for its size. So the best ways to identify the ironstone are by the back stamp or the maker's mark. You can research it on the spot if you have your phone handy. You can also familiarize yourself with some of the fake names out there so that you can automatically just know, oh, that's not the real deal. And I will share those in just a minute. So maker's mark / back stamps, the luster and color of the piece, the sound it makes when tapped, and the weight of the piece. Those are all key factors in identifying true ironstone. Let's take a look at some of the different back stamps we have here and some of the different designs. So like I said before, this one is Alfred Meekin. This is Old English ironstone, made in England. Now another thing about back stamps is that it's not always going to say ironstone. In fact, there's a good chance it won't say ironstone. Sometimes it says something like semi-porcelain or vitrified china or something like that. So different manufacturers called their products different things, but it still falls under the category of ironstone. And in just a minute, I will get to some things that you will never find on a genuine back stamp that modern manufacturers, or how do I say this nicely? The people who are trying to trick you, what they will put on the back stamp to try to make your brain think that it's antique. This one right here is another Alfred Meekin, England. This one says Ironstone China, J&G Meekin, Hanley, England. They were also another big producer. This right here is an example of exactly what it looks like. It's an old ironstone chamber pot. This would have been kept under someone's bed for the middle of the night or whenever they needed to use it and couldn't make it to the outbuilding. This one's quite blurry on the bottom, probably from frequent use. I can't quite make out what the manufacturer's name is. It does say England, and it has a suitable looking coat of arms, so everything else about it is correct too. Very bell-like, very heavy for its size, definitely the right sheen. This one is Snow White Regency by Johnson Brothers, made in England. This is a little bit more modern English ironstone piece, meaning 20th century. It's all relative, what you consider modern in the vintage and antique world. This is an example of what's called Flow Blue ironstone, which I'll get to in just a minute. This one's also by Alfred Meekin. And now I'm going to share with you my favorite find of Old English Ironstone ever. I found this at the thrift store back in October, and my heart just about burst out of my chest when I saw it. It was just, I was like, can this really be what I think it is? So let me show you what that is. I was walking through Goodwill back in October, just doing a quick browse because I always check, and I saw this sitting on the shelf, and I thought, no way. Like, the modern producers who are trying to make things for, you know, Target and stuff must be getting really convincing, because there's no way this could be sitting on the shelf. But indeed it was. This says Stone China, W. Taylor, Brook Street, Hanley. So this is indeed an ironstone teapot from England made in the 1860s, so right around Civil War era. It is my oldest find to date and one of my favorite. It's in great shape. Some people really like cracks and crazing in their pieces, which I'll get to what those are in just a second. But some people like their pieces a little more pristine. I'll take both. I don't have a preference, but this one doesn't have any chips or cracks. So this is truly my favorite piece to date. This is an example of an Old English ironstone coffee mug. If you notice, it doesn't have handles. Old mugs like this actually didn't have handles. There's no manufacturer's mark on the bottom, but I can tell by the color, the weight, and just the sound of it that it is indeed ironstone. For these pieces that don't have handles that I can dangle it by to test the sound, I tend to just hold it very gently like that. And I can kind of tell that it still has that bell-like quality, even though my fingers are dampening it. This right here is probably the largest ironstone bowl I have. Again, it doesn't have a manufacturer's mark on the bottom, but the color is right, the weight is right, and the sound is definitely right. It's very bell-like. I'm really hoping that this was a mixing bowl. I don't think it was a chamber pot. My husband thinks it might have been a chamber pot, but it just doesn't look like a chamber pot to me. It's a little too large, and I really think that it was a mixing bowl. At least that's what I'm telling myself. So what are considered cracks and crazing in ironstone? And is that problematic or is it desirable? Really, it comes down to personal preference. Some people like their ironstone more pristine. Some people like all the character of the chips, the cracks, the crazing, the discoloration. So a crack is obvious. It's a split running through the pottery. Discoloration is when the glaze, the pottery itself, has been discolored. You know, so it might have brownish spots, off-white spots, that sort of thing. Crazing is kind of that spiderwebby look that you might see on some pottery where there's been damage to the glaze and it makes the glaze crack and split a bit. So it gives it that kind of fine spiderwebby look. If you look really closely, you will see it on a lot of vintage dishes. I mentioned earlier that the English liked their ironstone to be more colorful and more ornate. This is an example of what we might call transferware. Transferware was when a design was transferred onto a piece of pottery, such as this. This right here is another example. It's got some brown and some blue in it with some foliage and some florals. This one's by John Edward from Fenton, England. It's the Minerva pattern. This is also quite old, from the 1800s. So really you've got a whole range of things that are considered English ironstone. Some are plain, some are more decorative, some are white, some are more colorful. just mentioned transferware. So that brings us to this. Doesn't that look like some nice Ironstone transferware? Probably pretty old, right? Let's take a look at the bottom. Oh, look, it has a maker's mark. It says Ironstone, Victoria ware Ironstone. Wouldn't you think that that's probably pretty old? Unfortunately, this is a perfect example of something that was made to seem much older than it is. Let's talk about fakes and reproductions. I see so many fakes and reproductions being sold as the real deal on Etsy. Now, I have nothing against Etsy at all. I sell on Etsy too. But unfortunately, many sellers, either because they don't know any better, or because they don't care, or they don't take the time to research, are selling these kind of reproductions and fakes for very high prices as the real deal. I actually recently sold one of these reproductions myself in my Etsy shop, but I quite clearly listed it as a reproduction and I priced it accordingly. You can see some of these reproductions here, and I've blocked the seller's names to not bash anyone here, but you can see some of these here. The maker's mark is quite wrong. So you'll see on the bottom, even though it says Ironstone, it gives some sort of date, like 1890. Real Ironstone back in the day would not have had such a date stamped on it. You can also just kind of tell from some of the designs, or at least I would hope you can tell, that they are not antique designs. In fact, some of them look very 1980s, like the geese. That would not have been on Ironstone, and yet sadly it's being marketed to the unknowing customer as antique or vintage. I think I sold mine for between $25 and $30 as a 1980s reproduction. It was really cute and all, but it just wasn't what it claimed to be.
A real Ironstone maker's mark would have had a name on it. They were proud of their work, and there was no way that they would have left their name off of it. It also probably would have included a country of origin, like England. Probably at some point, these reproductions or fakes had a Made in China sticker stuck on them, because that's legally required, but they were removed at some point. When you're determining if something is a fake or real, take a look at the bottom of the piece and around the rim and edges. Authentic ironstone would be completely glazed over every surface. Modern fakes and reproductions most often have unglazed rims and bottoms. They'll be rough to the touch and porous.
Also, I've come across these quite frequently in thrift stores and antique malls. I've picked them up, I've handled them. I know that they are super lightweight. They are very clearly made of some sort of lightweight earthenware, pottery. They're super thin, not durable at all. I mean, I could seriously crack that by like tapping on it too hard. Definitely not ironstone. So please do not fall for these. If you ever see something like this listed as true ironstone, please know that it is not. That brings us to this little beauty right here. Now, I knew that this was not real ironstone, but I got it for $3 at the thrift store. So I still considered that a pretty good deal because I like it. It's pretty and I'm going to put a plant in it. However, Victoria ware ironstone is not a real manufacturer's name or product. They even put this coat of arms on here with the lion and the unicorn. It says Victoria ware ironstone. If you ever come across Victoria ware ironstone on Etsy or in antique malls, which you will because I've seen it quite a few times, just know that it's not old. It's actually a Chinese reproduction made to look old.
To analyze this a little further, authentic maker's marks would have been no more than about an inch in diameter. These modern markings are 2 to 3 times that size and taking up almost the entirety of the bottom of the piece. What greatly saddens me is that many of the sellers who are selling these items have hundreds, if not thousands, of sales and are among Etsy's star sellers. I sincerely hope that it's out of ignorance that they're selling these items as antique.
Also, in pieces that are made to look like they're old, very often the manufacturer will purposely put crazing all over the piece to give it that look like it's been around for a long time. Something to look for is if the crazing is over the entire body of the piece, and if it just looks too uniform, then it's probably been put there on purpose. That's not always true, but it's definitely one more sign to look for when spotting a fake. So, Victoria ware ironstone. It's pretty. If you find it at the thrift store, buy it, enjoy it, but know that it's not Old English ironstone. That brings us to another topic of fakes. I don't have an example of a fake to show you for this one, but I have an actual flow blue plate here. Now, this is the Belmont design by Alfred Meekin, made in England, and it's called Royal Semi-Porcelain. Nowhere on this back stamp does it say flow blue. That's because the term flow blue wasn't used until much later as a nickname for this type of pattern. Manufacturers started experimenting with a new way to color their plates, and the blue coloring in the plate would kind of bleed a little bit, so it would kind of create this flowy, smudgy kind of look. And it actually caught on and became really popular with people, and so they continued purposely manufacturing it like that. And later on, it got the nickname Flow Blue. However, modern manufacturers started putting the words Flow Blue on the back of blue and white plates. That's not the real deal. A real Flow Blue plate would never say Flow Blue on the back. So what is a fair price to pay for all of this ironstone? It really comes down to a few things. When I'm pricing items for my shop, I have to take into consideration the rarity of the item. Can people find it anywhere, or is this a pretty rare item that deserves to cost a little bit more because of its rarity? 2, what is its condition like? Is it pristine? Does it have a bunch of chips and cracks? Is it falling apart at the seams? That's another thing to take into consideration. 3, the demand. Is it in high demand? What would people be willing to pay for it? You also have to take into consideration the price that the seller had to pay originally for the item. Also, just as a side note, when you're shopping somewhere like Etsy, you have to take into consideration that the seller put in a bunch of time to find the piece. They used gas and had to pay gas money to go hunt for the piece. They've taken the time to clean it up, photograph it, write up a listing. They've had to pay for packing materials and shipping materials, even the paper and the ink that they use to print out their packing slips. There's just so much that goes into the whole process of listing on Etsy or running an antique booth. If you didn't know this, Etsy also charges fees for listing on Etsy. So for every single listing, we have to pay a fee to even list the thing in the first place. Then Etsy also takes a cut of our profit, which is understandable. They have to make money too. But I'm just letting you know that we do have to factor those things in when we're pricing an item. So before you jump to the conclusion of, oh my goodness, that's so expensive, why are they overcharging for this? Just maybe take a minute to stop and consider all those different factors I threw out there, and then ask yourself if it truly is overpriced. You might be wondering how to determine the manufacturing date of some of these pieces. I'm going to tell you a few of my favorite resources for doing that. A lot of this goes by the back stamp you'll find on a piece. So there are quite a few charts and guides out on the internet specifically for dating back stamps. If you go to something like the Potteries, or there are a few others out there, they will actually have pictures of the individual back stamps. And the back stamps changed over the years. Manufacturers changed them up. And so this is an excellent way to figure out when your piece was manufactured. Usually you can just do an internet search for something like J&G Meekin back stamps, and then look up the chart for which one looks like yours, and it'll usually give you a date range for when your piece was manufactured. Now this one is my hidden gem, and I decided to go ahead and share it with you. This is something I've kind of been keeping on the down low because I felt like it made me look like an expert, but I'm going to go ahead and share it with you. This is a tremendous resource. It is the Encyclopedia of Marks of American, English, and European earthenware, ironstone, and stoneware from 1780 to 1980. This thing is really comprehensive. It gives you a history of ironstone, a history of all the variations of ironstone, and it beautifully gives you pictures of backstamps with manufacturers and dates, and it is so cross-referenced. You can look up things by manufacturer, you can look up things by pattern name. It's all cross-referenced. I've linked this below. I believe it's available on Amazon. I've linked it below if you're interested, but if you are a collector of ironstone or other pottery or dishware or whatever, this is a beautiful resource to have. I highly recommend it. All right, so getting a little bit more into the American ironstone, we start to encounter names like Homer Laughlin. Here's a Homer Laughlin piece. It says Homer Laughlin on the bottom. This is the Empress design, and it also has a bunch of other marks on the bottom. Some of these are actually date marks. So you can see here it says 115N. This is actually a code for the month and year that it was produced,
as well as the pottery location.
And you can find charts specifically for Homer Laughlin backstamps and dates available readily online. If you just type in something like Homer Laughlin manufacturing dates or something like that, it'll lead you to a few different sites that have the codes and the date that it means. It is a little bit tricky because it changed over the years exactly what they would put on here and what it meant. So just look up one of those charts online and it'll tell you exactly the date for your piece. I mentioned earlier that the Americans jumped on their own ironstone bandwagon and they came up with their own version of ironstone. With American ironstone, we start to get into these really chunky pieces that are super heavy and super durable. Some of these start to get into the realm of what's known as railroad china or hotel china, because specifically it was created for use on the railroad. It's super heavy, super durable. It can be rattling around in the galley, the kitchen, on the train, and not get broken. So some people would consider these more in the realm of the railroad and hotel china rather than true ironstone. It all depends on who you ask. Some people are just going to consider the Old English ironstone to be true ironstone. It's when you start to get into the more modern and American stuff that it starts to get a little bit questionable and dicey as to what you consider ironstone. This one says vitrified china, made in USA. I love the feel of these chunky bowls. These are some of my favorite things to find at the thrift store. I like to stack them. This one's by Rigo, just a cute little bowl. You'll also find the names like Buffalo China, Syracuse China, all sorts of names like that. Buffalo in particular made a lot of the oval platters and a lot of little bowls and all sorts of that kind of chunky white ironstone. I do want to touch on one other type of ironstone, and that is Federalist ironstone. So here's a cup from the Federalist ironstone. I actually found my entire set of Federalist ironstone at Goodwill probably 4 years ago, I think. I got an entire set of plates and cups, a teapot, sugar bowl, creamer, all of that stuff for like $45. I have it in my china cabinet over there. These were made in the 1960s and 70s in Japan and were sold specifically by the Sears Roebuck company. It has this very distinctive kind of 1960s mark on the bottom, and it says Federalist Ironstone. It came in several different colors, white, yellow. I think there was a blue floral pattern. It actually came in 2 different shades of yellow. I think one was lemon and one was like buttercup, I think. But anyway, some might not consider this to be true ironstone, but I just wanted to tell you about it because it still is a version of ironstone. Now, obviously, I did not touch on every single type of ironstone out there or all the information I possibly could give you on ironstone, but I wanted this to be more of a manageable video that would give you some practical tips and information. I would love to know what questions you have about ironstone or just to hear about some of your favorite ironstone finds, maybe something you found at the thrift store that you love. So drop me a comment below. I'll answer whatever questions I can. Thank you so much for watching, and I do plan to do some more vintage tutorials on here in the future. So stay tuned for that and make sure to subscribe for more cottage living, vintage and thrifting, and scratch recipes. I'll see you next time.